I have interviewed every living president as a journalist. It is a very tough job. It's very demanding. You're dealing with the most important issues of the day, asking tough questions of the most powerful man in the world.
For nearly 30 years, Norah O'Donnell has had a front row seat to history. As one of America's most recognizable broadcast journalists, she's interviewed world leaders, covered wars, elections, and global events, and spent her career making complex stories understandable. Today, she's a CBS News senior correspondent, a contributing correspondent for 60 Minutes, and the host of the new women's health podcast, Healthful. Did you ever have an experience where, because you were a woman, you were being undervalued?
Still to this day. The head of the network called me and said, "We want you to come anchor the evening news." And I said, "Well, I'll only do it if you pay me the same amount as Charlie Rose." They said, "Well, we can't do that." And I said, "Why not?" And they didn't have an answer. I took the job eventually because I was paid what he was being paid, but only because
Norah O'Donnell. For nearly 3 decades, you've reported on many of the biggest stories in America and around the world, and you've interviewed some of the most influential people on the planet. Norah, what do we need to know about you to understand the woman that you are and the life that you've built?
You know, I have tried to be a trusted journalist, in covering the biggest stories in the world. I had the honor of sitting in the chair once held by Walter Cronkite, who was known as the most trusted man in America. And I've always said, I want to be known as the most trusted woman in America. And so that extends to whether it's interviewing world leaders or presidents or politicians, to now with my new podcast, interviewing scientists and doctors and really just trying to impart useful information. I think we all want to devour information that's trusted and can help improve our lives. And so that's really my life's work, to be honest.
And I said this when we were walking, but so many Americans have grown up watching you on their televisions, and we've seen you as a journalist and a reporter. But I feel like I don't know that much about Norah O'Donnell and who you are and how you got to where you are. So for the purpose of today, I would love to start out by just you kind of bringing us back, telling us a little bit about your early life.
Yeah, I think it's true. A lot of people, when they meet me, they're like, wow, you seem a lot different in person than, what I kind of maybe glimpsed on television. And, I'm an Army brat. I'm one of 4 kids. I spent most of my childhood growing up in San Antonio, Texas, riding my bicycle around the neighborhood, swimming every day in the pool, getting lots of sunburns, which, back then we shouldn't have, but I did get a lot of sunburns as a kid. Played soccer as a kid. My dad, as I mentioned, was in the Army. And so we did do 2 tours of duty. When I was a kid, I lived in Landstuhl, Germany. And then when I was 10 years old, we lived in Seoul, South Korea. And that's actually where I got my start in television, because someone said to my mom, they're looking for people to voice English television tapes, because in Seoul, Korea, in the 80s, it was required that everybody learn English. And so they needed tapes with stories so you could learn English, essentially, just like we would learn Spanish or French here, in the United States. And so I actually got a job at 10 years old voicing all these tapes and doing a television show. Those pictures and images exist to this day. We've done stories about it on CBS. So that really was kind of my first time in front of a camera, was when I was 10 years old, which was 40 years ago.
And did you ever have any feeling that you might be in front of a camera again in the future?
I don't think so when I was 10 years old. I mean, I enjoyed having a job, and I enjoyed that I got a paycheck when I was 10 years old in cash, won, and I would go to Itaewon, which was the market, and I could buy, music tapes. I could buy Gloria Vanderbilt jeans and polo shirts and, whatever I wanted, because I was making a salary at 10 years old. It wasn't a lot, you know what I mean? But it was like $50, And so I think that was really the beginning of knowing that I wanted to have my own career. And, it began, I think, my interest in watching television and television news. I mean, my parents were big consumers of the news anyway. We always had tons of newspapers and magazines at our house. But I think that's how I started and began really watching the news more closely was because I was sitting in front of a camera myself.
Did you guys travel around a lot? Like, was Korea one of the main places you guys traveled to for your dad's job?
Yeah, and it was interesting when I was first hired at NBC, the head of talent, as they say, Elena Nachmanoff said, "Oh, we hire a lot of Army brats or military brats because we can put you guys anywhere and you'll fit in anywhere. You're so adaptable." And so we did move around a lot, but not as much as a lot of people do. Some people move every 2 years. My dad was a doctor, so he was mostly based in San Antonio, Texas. So really, just as a child was in Germany and then as a teenager in Seoul, South Korea. But one of the great things is after my dad finished his tour of duty in Seoul, South Korea, we took the whole family, 4 kids, on like a month and a half long tour of Asia. So that was really also sort of the beginning of, my traveling the world and learning a lot about Asia.
What do you think growing up in a military family teaches you?
Growing up in a military family teaches you so much. It teaches you about the power of public service. It teaches you about sacrifice. It teaches you about how much men and women put their lives and their families on the line to defend our country. I always say there are no better people than people that serve our country and the United States military. And so I am so proud of my dad. I'm so proud of my sister, who also serves in the military. And it's been part of now my career is reporting on military issues. When I was anchoring the morning show at CBS, I started a series called Profiles in Service. I named that after John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, in which I showcased women in the military that were doing great things. And, I continued that when I anchored the CBS Evening News. And I think if you look across a lot of the reporting that I do to this day, whether, it's on the CBS Evening News or on 60 Minutes, it's a lot of military issues. I mean, some of the investigative reporting that I did with my team at the Evening News was about sexual assault and in the United States military. And that won a number of awards, including Emmys. So it's been something that, because I grew up in a military family, I think I understand the culture and I understand the sacrifice. And I also really believe that supporting our military and our veterans is incredibly important.
So, Norah, in your new book, We the Women, which we are going to talk a lot more about towards the end of this conversation, you spoke about your grandmother and how she played a big role in your life. Can you tell us a bit about your grandma and what it was about her that influenced you?
Yeah, and I'm also, I'm the granddaughter of immigrants, like a lot of people in America. And I tell the story in my book, We the Women, about my grandmother. She was a Catholic who grew up in Protestant-controlled Northern Ireland in Belfast. She was the oldest girl of 9 kids, never made it past the 8th grade. And so my grandmother, her name is Mary Teresa, can you imagine 12 years old going through barbed wire and barricades, every day to go to work in a linen factory to support her family. So she didn't receive much of an education, but she was smart enough to know that she needed to leave Ireland. And so I just think about that at the age of 23, she boarded a boat all by herself, and crossed the Atlantic, which James Joyce called a bitter bowl of tears, and arrived here in New York and passing the Statue of Liberty, and started off working as an orderly in a hospital here in New York. And the story that gets me every time when talking about my grandmother is that she never lived long enough to meet my sister. And my sister is actually named after my grandmother. And I just wonder what my grandmother, Mary Teresa, would think to know that her namesake is now a chief surgeon at a major hospital. So here my own grandmother never made it past the 8th grade, and her namesake is a chief surgeon, which there are so few women like that in America.
It's amazing, though, thinking about that generation immigrating to America and what they had to go through even just to get here. Physically. She had
$20 in her pocket. That's it. And, in the National Archives, we found her name, and it says, "What's your occupation?" When she signed in at Ellis Island, it said hemstitcher. I mean, all she knew how to do was sew, She worked in a linen factory, but she made her way and raised a family, including my incredible mother. And, those sort of values and that courage that my grandmother had, I think is embodied in so many of the women in my book, We the Women, and so many women throughout American history who are just tough, gritty, and get the work done.
It's true. That generation is definitely built different, and our generations before us. I feel like when I was reading excerpts from your book and just kind of comparing it to my own life, I'm like, wow, I really am so privileged here living in New York City on the Upper West Side. And here are these women doing these crazy impressive things.
With so many of the rights that our grandparents and women before that did not enjoy. And so we have so many rights that they fought for, but that doesn't mean that we can't still stop fighting for some of the, the rights that we deserve, including increased funding on women's health and other things. Yeah.
Well, you went to Georgetown and you studied philosophy there. Is that correct?
Yes, I know. People are like, philosophy? How did that come about? You're at Georgetown is a Jesuit institution, and so you're required to take philosophy and theology. And so in taking the philosophy courses, I was like, I actually love this. I love reading and writing. I love critical thinking. And so I ended up being a philosophy major and an English minor. And I think it did actually prepare me well for a job in journalism, because critical thinking is a key part of what we do, and asking questions is a key part of what I do every day.
Philosophy. So I went to Fordham University, which is also Jesuit, and my mother-in-law went to Georgetown and my brother-in-law went to Georgetown. So we have a little bit of, Georgetown in the fam. Philosophy is a hard major.
Yeah.
I think people don't realize how hard it is.
Well, I mean, yes, because a lot of the text is in Latin and reading that ancient text, but I really enjoyed it. I did. And I much more enjoy reading and writing papers than doing, a math test or a science test. I mean, everybody in my family has a science degree. I'm the only one without a science degree. So it just works out for me to do more reading and writing.
Well, speaking of Georgetown, it's obviously a really competitive school. So I'm curious how success was defined in your household.
I think success in my house growing up was defined by being well-read. My parents were big readers. As I mentioned, there were always so many newspapers in our house and news magazines. I can so remember my father always had JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association. We always had Time Magazine or Newsweek or Life or so many magazines. And then living overseas as an Army brat. So the news was always important in my house. And so being well read on the topics of the day was considered incredibly important. And yes, I did grow up in an athletic family. My parents were the coaches of our soccer team. So I always played soccer. I always played right wing forward. And so we always did a lot of sports growing up. And, to this day, I enjoy sports very much. And I know my children do, as well. I do believe, and, you embody this so well. I think movement is medicine. And I think there's nothing better than walking and talking, running and talking. I mean, I trained for half marathons with my sister, in part because my sister talks a lot and it made the time pass really quickly. I go running with a friend named Carrie who talks the whole time. And then I'm like, we finished and I'm like, oh my God, we ran 6 miles. And that went by so quickly. So, you can make exercise so social in many ways. I play a lot of tennis now, which is incredibly social, and golf, which is incredibly social. So those were some of the values I grew up with as a kid.
So I didn't know you were a runner. So Norah and I, before this, we went for a walk, but that's so nice knowing that you like to run.
Well, in high school, I ran the 400. Yeah, so I ran the 400 competitively in Texas, which is no small deal. I don't mean to not be humble, but,
Wait, why is it such a big deal? Tell me.
Well, Texas is running in Texas is a big deal.
I didn't know that.
Well, just like football in Texas, really competitive athletes in Texas. I went to a big 5A public high school.
What about New Jersey? I feel like we're competitive there too.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure. I just know my experience about San Antonio. Yeah. We usually had 8 heats in the 400. And so then you would run, there were 8 different heats for a final, so if you think about 8 times 8, 60 people running for 8 spots in the final of the 400, every day. So, but anyway, I ran the 400, which was a sprint, and I started running more long distance, certainly as I went to, college and got older. So I really do enjoy running.
Well, going from philosophy to journalism, we know that at 10 years old, you were on camera. So there's some synergy here. But what was the journey like for you to go from studying philosophy from majoring in philosophy to then journalism?
Yeah, I think what many people may know about a liberal arts education is at Georgetown, you're encouraged to study whatever your interest is. And I was really thinking more about what I was intellectually interested in, and my parents supported me, doing that. But I always had a job when I was in college as well, to support myself. And so, I worked at a law firm, and I thought maybe I wanted to be a lawyer. I worked at the World Bank. That was about, communications and learning about the world. I got an internship at ABC News when it was This Week with David Brinkley. And I think that's when I really caught the bug and thought, you know what, I really do want to be a journalist, in addition to how I had grown up worshiping Barbara Walters and, reading the news and my parents talking about the importance of news every day. And so, when I got out of school, I worked for a publication called The Hotline, which was owned by National Journal, which reported on the news every day. And then, my first job, I was hired by NBC as a correspondent when I was 25 years old. So I was the youngest correspondent then at the time at NBC News, and I was so lucky that I got to work with some of the giants in television news, like Gwen Ifill, Andrea Mitchell, so many others, and of course Tim Russert, who was my boss at the time. And so I was really, I just look back and I think how fortunate I was to learn from the very best. And my office was literally right next door to Andrea Mitchell's, who's one of my, dear friends to this day.
So you got thrown pretty quickly into on-screen reporting.
Yes, very quickly. Yeah, I had been a print reporter for about a couple of years at Roll Call, which was a newspaper that covered Capitol Hill. And that was the beginning of cable news. And so I started doing some cable news hits it was Bill Clinton's impeachment, at the time. And so the networks called me, offered me a job. NBC was just launching MSNBC. So, I was doing a lot on MSNBC and NBC News. And so, yes, I very quickly had to learn how to report on television. So, some of those tapes have hopefully disappeared to the dustbin of history and no one will look them up. I'm sure there were some embarrassing moments on air, but it was a good way to learn quickly because I was doing so many hits over and over again. And as they say, repetition is the mother of learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like a muscle almost. You have to just keep working it. What is it like getting thrown into that, though? Like, what are the hardest things? What do you have to learn quickly when you're on air reporting?
I think the hardest thing that people don't appreciate about television news is that you have to take an enormous amount of information and boil it down into a very concise way and communicate it verbally and visually. And so reporting anyway is really difficult, for a newspaper and just getting information out of people, but then packaging it for television news, writing for television news is really a craft and an expertise that I think very few people possess, and do it really, really well. And I wasn't good at that at first, at NBC. I was a good print reporter, but I wasn't great necessarily at, when I was 25 years old at NBC, but I was able to learn and work with the very best producers in the business. And I attribute my success to working with the very best in the business since I was, 25 years old.
And we talked about this a little bit on our walk, but I'm curious at that time, and my mom mentioned this term that was almost called the boys club or something? I don't know. She brought it up to me. I don't know, the gentleman's club. I don't know, but
the boys club. Yes,
was it called the boys club?
Well, everything has been called the boys club.
Okay,
yeah,
everything's been called the boys club. But she referenced it in relation to the media industry and was saying it used to be called the old boys club where it was very male dominated. I know we talked about how there's been a lot of female faces even since you were first starting out, but what was the industry like for women at the time?
Well, look, I think the old boys club still exists to some degree, but it has gotten a lot better. And, there have only been 3 women to solo anchor an evening news broadcast. Katie Couric, Diane Sawyer, and Norah O'Donnell. Today, there are none. They hired 2 men to replace me on the evening news. So I do think there's still, a long way to go for women. There have, though, been women who have been presidents of the network, and I think that's a good thing. And so I do think in some ways media has been an opportunity, a good place in journalism for women. Look at the White House correspondents today. Many of the chief White House correspondents are women covering this administration, at CBS, Nancy Cordes, at ABC, Mary Bruce, at CNN, Caitlin Collins. And so I think that shows just how gritty, tough, and strong many of these female journalists are that are covering politics today. So sure, has there been an old boys club? Yes. I think a lot of that is changing.
Did you ever have an experience maybe early on where you felt like because you were a woman, you were being undervalued? Like, was there a certain moment that you remember? Or?
Still to this day.
Really? Yeah. Okay. You're like, Kate, every day.
Look, you have to prove your value every day, no matter what business that you are in. But there have certainly been many times in my career, and, I have not told all these stories before. I'm saving them from my memoirs.
Give me
which will be
one.
called
Give us
every,
one,
every
Nora.
second counts. I have so many good stories. It'll no doubt be a blockbuster of a book.
Your daughters have such a good mentor, by the way, in you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. My producers off camera are smiling at me because they know some of the stories. But I mean, I think one story, that I've told privately and probably not publicly is that when I was asked to join the morning news at CBS News, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I had filled in for a couple of days, and there was instant chemistry with Gayle King and Charlie Rose. And, just days after I finished filling in there, and it was a new show at the time, the head of the network called me and said, "We want you to come anchor the evening news." And I said, "That's great, but I don't think I want to do that." And they said, "Look, we really, really want you to do it. You're so good. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great." And I said, "Well, I'll only do it if you pay me the same amount as Charlie Rose." And they said, "Well, we can't do that." And I said, "Why not?" And they didn't have an answer. So I took the job eventually because I was paid what he was being paid. So I demanded equal pay. And in that instance, I was able to negotiate that, but only because I asked, not because my agent asked, who gets a cut of my salary,
Right.
not because anybody else said that I deserved it, but because I asked for it and demanded it. And look, that won't always happen in your career. It won't. That was one instance where it did work in my favor. That's one instance. I have a dozen instances where things didn't work in my favor, where I was not, treated equally. I mean, even before, just a year before that story, I had been courted to come join CBS from NBC. And they had offered me to be the chief White House correspondent, which is a very big job in network news. It's considered the stepping stone to the big job of being an anchor. Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, all of those, Brian Williams, they had all been chief White House correspondents before they were the anchor of the evening news or nightly news. And so when CBS was offering me that position, I said, "Great, I'll leave NBC for that. That's fantastic." Well, then I had an interview with a senior man at CBS. And in that interview, he said to me, "Well, how are you going to cover the White House with 3 young children at home?" And I felt the blood rush up through my face, like kind of how you get beet red when you're either embarrassed or angry. And I just blurted out, "Do you ask men that question?" And I don't remember his response. I do remember leaving that interview and calling my husband, and my husband said, "How'd the interview go?" And I said, "Look, that guy's a jerk." But the important thing is I did not allow that man to destroy my belief in myself that I could do the job or destroy my confidence, or else I never would have ended up in the same chair as Walter Cronkite.
Right.
So there's lots of stories where people doubted my ability to do a job or tried to instill a lack of confidence in me about the ability to do a job. And you just have to have people around you that say, "Don't listen to that person. Keep moving forward."
Yeah, and I feel like also as a woman, especially in those scenarios, is you have to be really good at compartmentalizing and almost being like, "I'm not going to let these situations affect these opportunities that are coming my way."
Yeah, my girls, I have 2 teenage daughters, and they had a lacrosse coach who I really like, Coach Burke, and she gives a big speech about how to be successful in life. And one of the things she says, show up in life. And she said, "Don't be easily offended." And I think that's true too. Don't be too easily offended. I mean, by that he said that. I mean, look, I'm telling that story over and over again, and I will eventually reveal who that person is in my memoirs, but not yet.
Oh, God. Oh, my God. Is that
but
person,
not yet,
are they still alive? Yeah.
I'm not going to answer that question, but yes.
Oh, no. I'm scared. Okay. We have a whole team of people. Your producer's her face is like this. She's like, "Oh, my God." White House correspondents. So I did know that this is a very this is one of the jobs that journalists get really excited when they get. So what is it about being, for people that don't know, let's talk about what is a White House correspondent?
Well, as a White House correspondent, you cover the White House and you travel with the President of the United States domestically and internationally. It is considered the premier beat in political reporting. So, I I started off covering Capitol Hill, where you cover, what's happening in Congress. And then as you mature and become more successful, if you kind of pitch to your company and say, I want to be a White House correspondent. And so, you're dealing with the most important issues of the day, not only domestically, but you're dealing with war in Iran or whatever it may be, and certainly asking tough questions of the most powerful man in the world. And so it is a very tough job. It's very demanding. It requires an extreme amount of professionalism and guts and a lot of reporting. And so everything you read on the front pages of the newspaper or on, the CBS Evening News or on CBS Mornings or 60 Minutes, a lot of that reporting all comes from our White House team. And it's not just the White House correspondents that you see on television. There are print journalists and there's a White House producing team that work with our on-air correspondents, but they are the very best in the business.
Yeah, it seemed like when we were there was a whole team of people around each person kind of in front of the camera. It's a whole operation.
Yes, it's a whole operation. It's not only a producing team that's with the White House correspondent, but you also have the crews, the cameraman, the audio, and then certainly all the team behind the scenes, the editors and stuff who put the packages together and producers. So it's a giant team that covers the White House. It's a pretty awesome thing also to watch a foreign trip, an international trip with the President of the United States, the huge package of people that travel alongside the president.
Right. What presidency were you covering when you were a White House correspondent?
Was I have interviewed every living president as a journalist. And I think that's, fairly unique to have that body of work. But when I was at ABC News as an intern, and then I covered Roll Call, I covered Congress as a reporter for Roll Call. That was during the Bill Clinton presidency. So every president since then, since Bill Clinton, I have covered their White House in some way. I was with George W. Bush when he was governor of Texas on his first trip running for president. And I, interviewed him just again 2 years ago. So I've known, a lot of these presidents I've known for, 25 years. I mean, in the case of Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, George W. Bush.
Who's your favorite on and off camera? Like personality-wise?
You can't answer that question. That's like, naming your favorite child. I don't have a favorite. I don't have a personal view of them. Covering them, I'm a professional and a journalist. But, they're all very interesting in their each and own way and challenging, to cover. But I think one of the most interesting interviews that I did recently was with President George W. Bush when we went to his ranch down in Crawford, Texas. And he released a book about paintings of immigrants. He's now painting. Yes. And it aired on CBS Sunday mornings. It is one of the most remarkable, fascinating interviews I think I've ever done with a former president of the United States. It still exists on YouTube, but you get to see both the personal side of President Bush. And for me, professionally, it was really interesting to see someone that I had first covered in 1999 and 2000, and then more than 20 years later, still be able to talk to him about really important issues of the day, including the issue of immigration reform, which he tried to do as president, but was unsuccessful and is still a hot button issue to this day.
And then it is so interesting to see just a side of somebody's life outside of their, presidency and politics and see that he's painting. It's so interesting. I loved watching Jenna Bush also sit down with all the living presidents recently.
Yes,
it was very
that was
cool.
A big deal that she got that interview with all the living presidents. Really, really interesting. I mean, I can remember pulling up to Crawford, Texas and his ranch at his home, and going inside his home. And when we pulled up the car, President Bush was standing there and waiting for me. And he's the former president of the United States. And that was kind of a big moment. And he was incredibly, gracious with his dog and his cats running around. And he gave me a tour on his all-terrain vehicle of the ranch.
Well, one really pivotal moment that I saw that you covered was you were reporting from the Pentagon on 9/11. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I mean, we're now approaching the 25th anniversary of 9/11, and I did report from the Pentagon on 9/11. I can remember actually that morning being in my apartment and watching, I was in at NBC and watching on the Today Show, the planes hit the World Trade Tower. And I remember turning to my husband when the second plane hit and said, "We're at war." And then immediately rushing to the Pentagon to cover what had happened there and did a primetime special. That was obviously one of the biggest things I've ever covered in my life, because that then launched the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, that were decades-long wars, and I think has defined our foreign policy to this day and our deep involvement in the Middle East, and certainly changed my life in so many ways.
Do you remember the emotions that you were feeling when you were reporting that day?
Yes, I do. I can vividly remember, too, I actually did what we call like a stand-up on the Memorial Bridge. And so if you've ever come into Washington and there were no cars, remember there was essentially like almost a shutdown where no one could go out, and there were just tanks rolling up Memorial Bridge, like a city under siege. And I remember feeling a deep sense of sadness and about the lives lost, and a deep sense of fear, when an attack has come home to America's shores. And those days were also just filled with 18-hour days of reporting and just going home and crashing and getting back up very early in the morning. And that went on for a really long time. But it also kind of began a new part of my career, because I covered the Pentagon and then traveled the world with then Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, which brought me some really interesting places, to not only Afghanistan, but Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, India, traveling all over the world with the defense secretary at a pivotal moment in American history.
And I mean, I'm somebody that gets very scared. Jeremy, my husband, hates it, but I always say I'm so scared, So I'm curious, how do you stay composed when there is kind of a deep fear in the back of your head, especially when you're on camera?
I don't know if it's because I grew up in a military family, but I don't have a lot of fear. I mean, I get anxious about things for sure, but I don't, I've gone 9 Gs.
Wait, what?
I've gone 9 Gs in an F-15.
Okay. What is that? Sorry.
Like in a fighter pilot.
Oh,
in a
F-15,
fighter
sorry.
plane, 9 Gs is about breaking the sound barrier almost.
When did you do that?
I've done it a couple of times. I did it once after 9/11.
Okay.
I was in an F-15, and then I did it again with the Thunderbirds maybe about 5 years ago. I went, 9 Gs in a fighter pilot. So I've hung out of the back of airplanes. I've reported from aircraft carriers and war zones. So I don't get scared. It's just kind of not normally an emotion that I have. As I get older, I'm certainly more fearful.
So you're the type of person that you'd want to be with in a stressful situation?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask my producers that.
Yeah. Because I feel like some people are and some people are not.
Look, I do think, and certainly the people that I work with in those situations, that we are focused. We are no nonsense. We get the job done. We have, when I was at the evening news for the first time ever, we did the evening news from an aircraft carrier. That had never been done before. We did it in the South China Sea, reporting about the situation in China. And then, we've reported from the Red Sea after the October 7th attacks in Israel. So that was something completely new, to try and actually anchor a live broadcast from an aircraft carrier. And so that requires an enormous amount of patience, fortitude. There's technical difficulties, no sleeping on an aircraft carrier, because remember, there's planes landing on an aircraft carrier. It's so incredibly noisy and hot. So I work with people who have an incredible amount of fortitude and patience, and really focused on getting the job done, who don't complain. We don't complain when we're in the situation. We just get the job done. And then when we get back home, we have a couple of glasses of wine and complain, but not when we're on the job. But look, we're professionals, and the job that we are sent to do is tell a story. And, I have talked about this publicly, but, certainly after the October 7th attacks in Israel, and talking to people who had gone through the worst experiences, had family murdered and by Hamas. I came back to the United States and had to go to therapy. And I think many of the people I worked with have talked about that as well. And so I think that's one of the things that's not totally understood, is that part of being a journalist too is sometimes meeting people at the worst moment in their lives. They've either been through a school shooting, they've lost their home from a tornado or a hurricane, they've just been through a horrific terrorist attack. And talking to those people is our job. We're trying to tell their stories, help people understand the gravity of situations, but it does leave a personal imprint on us that sometimes it does require therapy. And I talk about that openly because I think that therapy is incredibly important for everyone.
I know that is so interesting. And I feel like that's something that, I mean, it makes so much sense, but yeah, it's something that I wouldn't have known about if you hadn't said it. Okay. Speaking of reporting and during hard situations, the White House Correspondents' Dinner was the last time I saw you doing a sit-down interview with the president. I don't know if you've done another one since, or have you? I don't know.
No, I did. Well, I did 2 interviews with the president for season 58 of 60 Minutes. So we had interviewed him early in the season. I believe it was on the November 1st episode of 60 Minutes. That was about an 75-minute long interview. We posted all of that and the transcript online. And then the second interview was in 2026 after the White House Correspondents' Dinner and that attempted assassination attempt.
So talk about staying calm, cool, and collected under pressure and professional on camera. Walk me through those 24 hours between the White House Correspondents' Dinner and you and President Trump's sit-down interview.
Well, we were there all at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which I've been going to for 20 years because it's a dinner that is about giving scholarships to young people who want to go into journalism. And just very quickly at the beginning of the dinner, we heard this loud crash of noises. It was like some people heard gunshots. I did not. I heard, glass breaking and people running into the ballroom. And there was confusion about whether the running into the ballroom was the gunman, potential multiple. Just in the moment, so many people ducked under the table to hide for safety. And then, of course, there were those images of the president being escorted out by Secret Service. Once there was a sense that things might have calmed down a little bit, we were all still stuck inside the ballroom. We were just trying to figure out what happened. That was this just period of like, who was it? Is there still an ongoing threat? So that was, certainly a frightening, situation. And also we had a job to do. It was a room full of reporters and journalists. It also became quickly clear that, and we were all also worried about our colleagues, making sure that everybody was safe. It also became quickly clear that we needed to think about what to do the next day for Sunday's version of 60 Minutes. So as soon as I got out of the ballroom, which was late, the president briefed from the White House briefing room. And I can remember, at around midnight too, I have, texts back and forth to the White House requesting an interview with the President of the United States, as were other producers, that I work with at 60 Minutes. We were asking at that time, like, look, if the president speaks, can we get him for 60 Minutes? Because that was the biggest news story in the world at that moment. What happened?
Yeah, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe, I knew he was going to speak or address the public, but it was
Yeah, we thought he was going to come back into the ballroom and address in the ballroom, but the Secret Service wanted him out. He returned to the White House, that secure facility, and briefed from inside the White House press briefing room, where you saw many of the journalists were still in black tie or in their evening news gowns. But that's again a reminder about just how hard the work of journalists how hard journalists work is that they never stop working,
right?
No matter what. And in order to report what was a big story at the time, it still is to this day, is a huge story, trying to figure out exactly what happened and why there are these threats against the president.
Right. And so many of you were actually at the dinner, which I'm sure there probably was a moment where you were fearing for your life and your safety.
Yeah, many people were, deeply upset. And because there were family members that were worried about their safety and security. And so it was a lot that went into that evening.
Well, you were one of 3 women in history, as we've said, to solo anchor the evening news alongside Katie Couric, Diane Sawyer. By the way, Katie Couric growing up was like one of my favorite people to watch. And to this day, I really enjoy watching her on social media. But what did it mean to you to be a solo anchor?
It was such an honor and a privilege to be named the anchor of the CBS Evening News. And at the time, to be the only woman on one of the 3 big network newscasts. And, that also happened during COVID. And so really the evening news became in many ways like a public health broadcast. And so we saw our ratings soar because many people were at home, not going out. You were either cooking at home or ordering in, and everyone was watching the evening news broadcasts and the news because we were all so hungry for information about what is this virus. Our kids are not going to school. What does this mean? Like, what's the cure? Is there going to be a vaccine? And so it was a really interesting time to be anchoring the evening news at really, one of the most incredible news stories of my lifetime, this COVID outbreak. And so, luckily we stayed. The evening news broadcast came out of Washington, D.C., and a small number of my team were able to come in each day. We limited the amount of time in the studio together, but we worked in the studio, went to work during COVID. And I'm really grateful for my team for, wearing masks and gloves, and we worked through that.
Mm-hmm. That must have been such a crazy time to be one of the faces on television, because I remember just tuning in constantly to the news, being like, what's going on? You guys really became our trusted source.
Of course. And, remember, certainly the scenes in New York, with so many people losing their lives, with the focus on the incredible caregivers and people that worked in hospitals that took care of so many people, with COVID. It was quite a time to be explaining the news. Some of our colleagues here in New York were so grateful to us. They would send us cupcakes most afternoons. So we actually all ended up putting on about 15 or 20 pounds during COVID, like a lot the
COVID-15 is real.
The COVID-15. But, we were at work, and we had a lot of, it was a difficult story. So we certainly were satiating with a lot of treats in the afternoon.
Well, that was also probably nice for you to kind of keep a sense of normalcy, because so many of us were working from home. I remember being so scared that I was at the time working in advertising, and I actually did end up getting laid off, but I was telling my mom, I'm like, there's no way we're going to be able to do our jobs from home, So it's nice that you guys were able to kind of keep that.
Right. And the court has and so much about COVID has changed, how we work. And I think, hopefully this country is more prepared for the next pandemic.
Oh my God, I hope there's not another pandemic in my lifetime, Nora.
I know. Oh, well, it's an open question. Yeah.
I know, it's so true. I feel like every time we hear about some disease going around, virus
you
going
worry
around,
about
I'm
an
like,
outbreak.
oh my God, can't happen again. I was actually living on the Upper West Side during that time period.
Yeah.
It was weird.
Yeah. I was in Washington. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So same thing, big city. Okay. Well, you've covered some of the world's biggest events. You've also interviewed some of the most influential people. You are now starting to interview scientists and women's health experts with your new podcast, Healthful, which I feel honored to be sitting down with you today because it's launching today. So you guys are seeing this kind of after the fact, but go listen to Nora's podcast because it's out now.
Thank you.
What's inspired this new chapter for you?
I have long been interested in issues of health and wellness. But, so much of my reporting is on political or national security affairs. And about, in the last year, our new editor-in-chief, Barry Weiss, asked everybody at CBS, to send her a memo. And so I wrote about my experiences at CBS, and I said, and by the way, one thing I'm really interested in doing and innovating on is the area of women's health, and I'd love to do a podcast. And she loved the idea, and the team at CBS has been incredibly supportive. And the reason I'm so interested in doing a podcast on women's health is because women's health has been underfunded and under-researched for far too long. And women deserve better. And women want that information. We are more than a majority of the population, and yet at the National Institutes of Health, we are less than 10% of the dollars spent on that research. That's just not fair. That's unequal. And what does that mean? What has not yet been discovered or researched that can improve women's lives, our health, and our happiness? And so I'm taking everything that I have learned in the past, 20 years as a journalist with, standards, searching for facts, and now applying that to women's health. And so I'm trying to swing open the doors for our viewers and audience to hear from the world's leading experts on science and medicine. And we're inviting the audience to send us your questions and ideas for who you want to talk with, because I just want to share information, trusted information, and using my skills as as someone who interviews people for a living to sort of pull out that information. Because there's a lot of stuff, as well read as I am, that we don't know about women's health.
I also feel like it's exciting that you are a trained journalist and you're known for doing extensive research. So it's going to be fun to listen to your conversations and hear the questions you have.
Yes, I know. And I have to give a shout out to the team of producers I work with, because the same producers, I work with to, produce an interview with Pope Francis or the President of the United States are working on this podcast.
That's so
Her
fun.
name is Julie Morse Goff. And so what does that mean? That means the same rigor that we bring to interviewing the President of the United States is we're going to bring to interview the world's leading doctors and scientists. We are going to get information to help you. What does that mean about what do hormones do if you take hormone replacement therapy and you're in perimenopause or menopause? How does the gut microbiome and what you eat influence your brain health? Is Parkinson's something that begins 20 years before in the gut? Yes, scientists believe that. What about breast cancer? If you have dense breasts, which half of us do, has your doctor recommended a sonogram or an MRI? Well, mine didn't. And I just learned that on our podcast. And certainly if you have a history of breast cancer in your family, you should be recommended that. I did not know that. And I mean, I thought I had good access to healthcare. You know, so many things that can improve the quality of our lives. What additional screenings should we get? We're also going to be talking about beauty and skin. I'm someone who has had melanoma and skin cancer, so ways to prevent that. But on the flip side,
Us Irish women,
I know,
have it hard.
I know. But and on the flip side, so how do we prevent skin cancer, right? How do we protect our skin? And then also, how can we look better as we age? So what creams, retinols work? What lasers work? Botox, blueberries, the whole thing. We're going to break all that down to talk about, not only how to feel better and be healthier, but in some cases too, if you want to have your skin look better. It is the largest organ in the body, your skin.
No, it's great. And women love getting individualized attention when it comes to their health because you're right, it has been so under-researched. I also love hearing conversations about fertility and infertility just because that's a stage of my life. So just, it'd be fun to have you interview a OBGYN.
Right. And I think finding answers is so difficult. I mean, just since we have launched this podcast, I have had men and women come up to me and say, you know what? I mean, one man just today said, you should do a whole segment on eczema. My wife has eczema. Another woman said to me, what about endometriosis? No one is getting the proper diagnosis. People suffer for a very long time with endometriosis. So I think a lot of these topics, we can go and find the world's best experts on these topics and hopefully impart and educate on these really important issues.
Well, it's fun to see you take such a female-focused approach to your work. And, we have your book kind of sitting behind you. I don't know if you guys are watching or not or listening, but if you're watching, you might be able to see Nora's book, We the Women. It's right behind her head.
Go women. Go women.
Yeah, we're in a female-focused year, and I'm loving it for you. You spent 3 years writing this book, We the Women. We referenced it at the beginning of the podcast when we were talking about your grandmother. What inspired you to write this book to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence?
Well, I knew that this would be a big year where there would be so many celebrations across America for America's 250th birthday. And I wanted to make sure women were part of that conversation and women in history were part of that conversation. And so, yeah, it's been a nearly 3-year-long effort sort of excavating these stories about the women in history that we didn't learn about in school. And I didn't learn about any of them in school. And I know that's not just my personal experience because the National Women's History Museum says only 15% of what we are taught in school focuses on the achievements and accomplishments of women. That needs to change. So I hope We the Women can be sort of a book that if you're searching for who are the women in history I didn't learn about in school, that's your Bible essentially for that. And it's just the first step because we didn't cover every woman. We couldn't in that book. And I hope it encourages more people to tell stories about women. And here's kind of my big thing. The stories we tell and the stories we read about shape our culture. Our culture defines everything. And what does it say about our culture if we don't tell stories of important women? How does that shape how young girls think about what is possible for them? In writing this book, I kept thinking over and over again, what if I had learned about this woman? Would I have a different sense about being rejected? Would I have a different sense about what is possible for me if I had learned this story, about what I could dream to become as a little girl? And I think, yes, I do. And I say that as, 52-year-old Norah O'Donnell, who's anchored the CBS Evening News and is a 60 Minutes correspondent. There are so many courageous, brave, determined women in American history that I did not know about. Women have been bleeding for this country in terms of taking a bullet for this country since the very start, since the Revolutionary period when they weren't allowed to serve in the military. But we don't learn those stories. Women are great patriots and change makers. And so that's really what it's just a reminder about just kind of how awesome women are, to be honest.
No, the book's great. And in the book, you cover 35 women. How hard was it to pick those 35?
It was very difficult because there are so many incredible women throughout history. And so, it's we the women, the hidden heroes who shaped America. So they're women we didn't learn about in school. And each of the women in some way also, encompasses some larger value. And they also have a tie back to the Declaration of Independence because that's what we're celebrating 250 years of. A lot of people have talked about the Declaration of Independence in those 13 words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And it goes on to say, with certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But people have called that sentence the most important sentence in human history. Wow. Why? Because the Declaration of Independence not only sparked the revolution, founded America, but also those words that all men are created equal are literally at the heart of every great moral and political battle in American history. The abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. All those were based on, hey, our country is not living up to this all men are created equal. It doesn't include women. It doesn't include Black people. It doesn't include Native Americans. And people kept going back to the Declaration and saying, we got to fix this. We got to live up to the values that our country was founded on. And that's the story of the women in these books, because they were all patriots that said, I am going to push for change in this country to make sure that we live up to those values.
Well, even in the first chapter of your book, it was amazing to find out that there was a woman on the Declaration of Independence, which is something I never would have realized.
I know. We talk so much about our founding fathers. We've heard of John Hancock and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Their name is all on the Declaration of Independence. But it turns out there's also a woman's name. And so in the book, We the Women, we tell the story of Mary Catherine Goddard.
Is there any woman that you left out of the book that moved you in a big way?
Well, that's a great question. And a lot of people have said, will you do volume 2 of
Right.
We the Women?
We need a part 2.
Yeah, need a part 2. I think I'm going to do a different book, not the memoirs, but something else. But one of the stories I do tell in the book is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. And this was one of the first women in America to become a doctor when women had no right to education. She wanted to be a surgeon in the Civil War. And they said to her, you can't be a surgeon. You're a woman. And she said, well, I can help. I want to help. I can help save lives. And so she was there at Bull Run and Fredericksburg, which were some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. She was captured as a prisoner of war by the Confederate Army. When she was released, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor. Now, you've seen that when the president awards that honor, that medal. It's got a ribbon like this color with the stars on it and that big gold medal. That the Medal of Honor is the highest commendation you can get for bravery in combat. 3,500 Americans have received that Medal of Honor. To this day, only one woman has received that medal, and it's Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. And then they tried to take it away from her because she wasn't technically allowed to be a member of the military. So we tell her incredible story in the book, and I think that's just a reminder, too, of just like great women that have served our country, in combat. And so today, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker is known as the first female Army surgeon and the only woman to have received the Medal of Honor.
It's so great knowing the appreciation you have for the U.S. military because you come from a military family. It's amazing.
But I think there should be a movie about her.
Yeah,
or
that's
a
really
whole
cool.
series on Paramount Plus, Steven Spielberg should produce it.
So the book is divided into 50-year chapters, but as you stepped back from the timeline, was there a common thread that you found that connected all of these women regardless of when they lived?
Yes, absolutely. These women were revolutionaries. They were tough as nails. They did not give up. They believed in the values that are in the Declaration of Independence. They did a lot of their work in concert with other women. They didn't go it alone. They built networks to try and change America. And, I think about the silent sentinels. We did learn about them in school. They were the women who stood outside of the White House, in 1918 through, the rain and the cold, demanding the right to vote. And many of them were arrested, they were jailed, they were beaten, they were force-fed. And the outcry over how these women were treated for just demanding the right to vote and literally just standing outside of the White House, it sparked so much outrage that then led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote that we enjoy to this day. And so I just think about, I think anytime you head to the ballot box, we should always pay tribute to the women who fought so hard so that we have that right to vote.
It's wild to think too about some of these things. Like, they weren't that long ago when you really think about it, Even like women being able to get a credit card was like,
yes.
That was pretty recent.
I know, you read the book, exactly. 1974, that was the year I was born, 52 years ago, which is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. It was women in Congress, bipartisan group, that made it so that you don't need a husband's signature to get a credit card or to get a mortgage. That was the 1970s. And then also in the 1970s, too, Ruth Bader Ginsburg arguing 6 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, winning 5 of them, that essentially declared sex discrimination illegal for the first time. So much, I think the 70s were a legal turning point in many ways for women. Griswold v. Connecticut, that allowed women the right to be able to use contraception, married couples to use contraception. And so, a lot changed in my lifetime, even in my lifetime. So I always wonder, what's going to happen in the next 50 years?
The one story, too, that stood out to me just because I lived right next to the Brooklyn Bridge for so long was the woman responsible for really being the project manager, basically, of the Brooklyn Bridge.
The chief architect, Emily Warren Roebling. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I've climbed to the top of the Brooklyn Bridge for stories I did for my Profiles in Service series. And so, I know how awesome the Brooklyn Bridge is. And at the time that it was built, just at the turn of the century, in 1898, I think is when it was completed, you essentially was the largest suspension bridge in the world. It was called the 8th wonder of the world. And it turns out that Emily Warren Roebling's husband fell ill while trying to build the bridge. So for more than a decade, she took over as the chief engineer and chief architect. So she was the first woman to actually cross the bridge with her teenage son and a rooster on her lap for good luck. And she actually is featured briefly in the new series, The Gilded Age.
Cool.
She's in there briefly in The Gilded Age, But so she is a little more, some people know Emily Warren Roebling, and the New York Times didn't overlooked on her. But she's a great, great story of literally, women, that saying behind every great man is a great woman. Essentially, Emily Warren Roebling is an example of the Brooklyn Bridge would not exist if it were not for this woman, and she deserves more credit.
Yeah, we need to reinvent that quote, I feel like.
Yes, and also
I think women and men make great teams.
Of course they do. And this is not at all disparaging, to men, because men have done great things too, but there are books about that. And this is a book about the women who have done great things that haven't gotten the recognition that they deserve.
So kind of our final question as we wrap up, but for women listening that feel like they don't have the status, the experience, or the permission to act, what is your advice to them?
Read We the Women. I mean that. I don't, that's not, you don't have to, buy my book for that. I'm just saying, but throughout history, women have not had the permission to act. They didn't have the voice. They weren't respected. They didn't have the opportunity to go to school. They were rejected from colleges, from medical school. They were told they weren't good enough. And so the story of American history is women constantly being told no and them fighting for their rights. And I hope that that's inspirational for many people. It is for me. It reminds me about what great rights I enjoy to this day, and that I have a voice and that I should use my voice for good. And that's part of what writing this book has really changed me. And part of this podcast is about using my voice to help change women's health. I really want women to not only be healthier and happier, but ultimately be more powerful so we can rule the world.
I love it. I'm really excited for this new chapter for you. I can't wait to watch the podcast. I have so many ideas for guests for you because we've had so many female experts on that I would love to see you sit down with.
Yes. I know.
But thank you so much for being on Post Run High with me today and walking with me.
I know, Kate. Exactly. Congratulations on your new baby, and let's go running. Let's go running soon.
I would love to. Maybe we do the mall in DC. That'd be cool.
That'd be cool. Very cool.
Haven't done that yet. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.